We are in the year 1963. It's an ordinary autumn morning, September the 4th. Swissair Flight 306 departed Zurich just minutes ago and is now climbing, bound for Geneva, over Swiss airspace. Many of the passengers are flying for the very first time in their lives. They sit by the windows, gazing outside in fascination. Beneath them, the landscape lies hidden under a dense blanket of fog. Only a few scattered hills rise above it. The first minutes of the flight pass entirely routinely. No one on board suspects the catastrophe that is already unfolding beneath their feet at this very moment. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots struggle to maintain control of the aircraft. One system after another begins to fail. Moments later, the crew loses control, and Swissair Flight 306 plunges toward the ground in a steep dive. Seconds after the aircraft disappears back into the fog, the small village of Dürrenäsch is shaken by a tremendous explosion as the aircraft impacts a field at the edge of the village at high speed. None of the 80 people on board survive the crash. Switzerland experiences the deadliest aviation disaster in its history at that time. An entire nation is plunged into mourning and disbelief. What happened on that fateful day? Why did the crew lose control of a nearly new aircraft? Was it pilot error? A technical failure? Or were the dangers rooted in circumstances that were still completely unknown at the time? This is the story I want to tell you. A story whose origin lay deep within the aircraft itself. A story about procedures and practices that pushed the technology of the time to its limits. And about ominous parallels to later aviation disasters. Tragedies that, decades afterward, would claim many more lives. To understand the events of that fateful day, we must return to the place where this catastrophe began. A catastrophe whose answers lay hidden deep within the fog at Switzerland's busiest airport. In the early morning hours of September 4th, 1963, the crew assigned to Flight 306 arrives at Zurich Airport. That day, Swissair Flight 306 is scheduled to operate from Zurich, Switzerland, via Geneva to Rome, Italy. The flight is fully booked. 74 passengers and 6 crew members are expected on board for the first leg to Geneva. The aircraft assigned to the flight is a relatively new Sud Aviation Caravelle, a jetliner manufactured in 1962 and delivered to Swissair in October of the same year. At this point in time, the aircraft is less than 1 year old. The Caravelle was a French-built narrow-body jet airliner produced between 1958 and 1972. It was the first commercial jet to feature 2 rear-mounted engines, a configuration later adopted by aircraft such as the Douglas DC-9, the Boeing 727, and the MD-80 series. This design resulted in a comparatively quiet cabin and a high level of passenger comfort. The Caravelle also shared its distinctive nose design with the de Havilland Comet, produced under license, and incorporated several unconventional design features for its time. One of these was a braking parachute, deployed after landing to assist deceleration, as early Caravelle models were not equipped with thrust reversers. At the time, Swissair operated a fleet of 8 Caravelles, primarily used on short and medium-haul routes. Since their introduction into Swissair service, the aircraft type had experienced no major incidents, with one notable exception. On April 25, 1962, a Caravelle was forced to land with a jam nose landing gear. However, the incident was not attributed to a design flaw, but to improper maintenance carried out the night before the flight. In this incident, no one on board was injured. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service shortly after. Around 6 a.m., the crew of Flight 306 assembles to begin preparations for the short flight to Geneva. The captain on today's flight is Eugen Boly, born in 1926. With a total of 7,600 flight hours, including 380 on the Caravelle, he is considered a highly experienced airman. Swissair rates his skills as above average, calm, deliberate, and decisive. Thoroughly prepared, with strong situational awareness and clear command presence. Beside him sits First Officer Rudolf Widmer, also born in 1926. With 6,000 flight hours, from which 380 were on the Caravelle, he too is an experienced aviator. As part of the pre-flight briefing, the pilots request current and forecast weather information from the Meteorological Service. This morning, Zurich Airport is covered by dense fog, with rapidly changing local visibility conditions. Such fog is not unusual in Zurich, particularly during the autumn and winter months. Nevertheless, the conditions make an on-time departure uncertain. The captain therefore decides to personally assess the visibility on runway 34 before committing to takeoff. As time passes, passengers for Flight 306 begin checking in. For many of them, it is the first time they will ever fly. Shortly before the crew makes its way to the Caravelle, the latest weather information is requested once more. Conditions have not improved. By 6:40 a.m., the entire crew is on board, ready to receive the first passengers. It does not take long for all 74 passengers to walk across the apron and take their seats. 12 minutes later, the crew overhears a radio transmission from another Swissair aircraft requesting the current visibility on runway 16/34. The reported values are 60 meters for runway 16 and 210 meters for runway 34. Other than that, neither turbulence nor icing conditions are present at the time. Given the poor visibility, Flight 306 requests a follow-me vehicle to guide the aircraft to runway 34. The vehicle arrives shortly thereafter, and the Caravelle begins taxiing at low speed, following it through the dense fog. At 7 a.m., another visibility update is issued.
Zurich Tower, visibility update. Runway 34180 meters. Runway 1660 meters.
The further deterioration in visibility places the crew in a difficult position. According to Swissair operating regulations, the minimum required visibility for a Caravelle takeoff is 200 meters. While attempting to reach the threshold of runway 34 via taxiway 5, the follow-me vehicle becomes disoriented in the thick fog and inadvertently turns onto taxiway 4 instead. Air traffic control subsequently transmits the standard departure information to Flight 306 and clears the aircraft to taxi onto runway 34 at 7:03 a.m. The pilots then request precise wind information and ask for permission to assess the runway conditions.
Could we taxi onto runway 34? Proceed down the runway and then back to have a look.
Zurich Tower approves, and Swissair 306 is turning onto runway 34.
We'll taxi about halfway down the runway and then return.
To better judge the visibility, the aircraft is taxiing approximately half the length of the runway. At 7:07, Flight 306 crosses runway 2810 and transmits.
We're right by runway 28 now, still heading down runway 34.
Directly after that, Flight 306 contacts the other, still waiting Swissair Flight 140.
When we come back, we'll let you know how it looks. And after that, you may be able to depart immediately.
2 minutes later, at 7:09, the crew turns their aircraft around near taxiway 7 while giving Flight 140 their impressions of the conditions on the runway.
We can therefore establish that there is patchy drifting fog with varying conditions, in some places quite good and in others rather dense fog banks. And we also have the impression that our engine blast had some effect while taxiing.
It takes another 4.5 minutes to taxi back into the takeoff position, and at 7:12, Flight 306 finally receives its takeoff clearance. After approximately 1 minute and 1,612 meters, the aircraft lifts off and the landing gear is retracted. Shortly after takeoff, the Caravelle already emerges from the thick fog layer into clear air. Up to that point, everything appears to be proceeding according to plan. Approximately 2 minutes after takeoff, Flight 306 makes a routine radio call, requesting the current ground temperature. After that transmission, radio contact ceases. The aircraft continues its climb and initiates a left turn towards Geneva. At that moment, there were no outward indications of the events that would unfold in the minutes to come. It doesn't take long, however, before the first signs appear that something is wrong. In their minds, the pilots are already thinking ahead to the arrival in Geneva. The city is only a short hop from Zurich, and the remaining flight time is little more than 20 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, in the rear section of the cockpit, a circuit breaker pops. Captain Bowley turns to check which one has tripped. While going through the hundreds of circuit breakers, a second breaker suddenly pops, then a third. Almost simultaneously, First Officer Widmer also notices something alarming. The pressure in one of the hydraulic systems is dropping. The crew still has no clear picture of what is happening to their aircraft. But with every passing second, it becomes increasingly clear that this routine flight is turning into nothing less than a nightmare. As they work through the first abnormalities, trying to get a grip on what is wrong, an unpleasant odor begins to spread through the cabin. A smell nobody ever wants to encounter on board an aircraft: the smell of fire. More circuit breakers begin to trip, and additional systems start to fail. Flight attendants try to pinpoint the source of the burning smell. Moments later, the fire warning bell begins to blare inside the cockpit. As the situation rapidly escalates, controlling the aircraft becomes increasingly difficult. Control forces grow heavier. The response becomes sluggish. The nose begins to drop, and Flight 306 starts to roll to the left. The pilots fight to pull the aircraft out of the rapidly increasing descent, but it no longer responds as it should. At 7:21 a.m., Swissair Flight 306 transmits a final desperate call. At 7:21 a.m., a violent explosion shattered the silence of Dürrenäsch. Swissair Flight 306 had nosedived into a field at the edge of the small village. Dense fog initially concealed most of what had just unfolded. Only as it slowly lifted around 8 a.m. did the full scale of the catastrophe become visible. Images that would become etched into the history of aviation and make headlines around the world.
It is now morning, 11 o'clock. The fog has lifted. The fog, in which, almost 3 hours ago, the Caravelle that departed from Zurich Kloten Airport crashed. We are standing here at the grave of 80 people. Exact numbers are not yet available, but we must already assume that neither passengers nor flight personnel have survived.
The impact carved a crater roughly 6 meters deep into the field at the edge of the village. The aircraft and its occupants were torn apart into thousands of pieces, scattered hundreds of meters across the surrounding area. It quickly became clear that no one could have survived the crash. All 80 people on board were killed on impact. By sheer chance, the aircraft narrowly missed nearby houses that were occupied at the time. A direct hit would likely have claimed even more lives. Until the intense fire in the impact crater was finally extinguished, nearly 2.5 hours passed. Flight 306 was airborne for only about 9 minutes and made it just 35 kilometers far. What happened on board the Caravelle? What led to the crash that claimed the lives of 80 people? To determine the cause of the crash, an investigation was initiated immediately after the accident. Investigators rushed to the crash site, which was already guarded by armed forces due to the sheer number of onlookers. It did not take long for the first alarming indications to emerge. However, not at the crash site itself, but 35 kilometers away, at the threshold of runway 34 at Zurich Airport. The site from which the Caravelle had departed just hours earlier. There, debris from the landing gear, as well as traces of hydraulic fluid, were discovered. Closer examinations revealed that these findings consisted exclusively of components from the left main landing gear of the accident aircraft. Although the investigation was still at a very early stage, a clear picture was already beginning to emerge. Whatever had caused the crash of the Caravelle had, with a very high degree of probability, originated in the failure of the left landing gear unit during takeoff. In the meantime, several eyewitnesses who had been located along the flight path of Flight 306 came forward. Independently of one another, they reported having seen smoke and flames on the underside of the aircraft shortly before the crash. These witness statements were supported by other alarming findings. Along the final segment of the flight path, numerous aircraft parts were found scattered over a distance of approximately 12 kilometers. The debris field extended between Megenwil and the crash site near Dürrenäsch, with the density of debris steadily increasing the closer it came to the point of impact. The debris consisted of parts of the left landing gear bay, the rear section of the left wing, the lower fuselage behind the wing trailing edge, as well as the tail section of the aircraft. This distribution clearly indicates that the aircraft had already begun to break apart in flight, minutes before it ultimately crashed. In light of the large number of independent indications, suspicion quickly arose that a fire on board the Caravelle may have played a central role in the crash. To investigate this hypothesis, as many pieces of wreckage as possible were recovered and analysed. As a result, by the end of the recovery operations, approximately 90% of the aircraft's total structure had been recovered and assigned to specific assemblies and systems. The remainder could not be located or could no longer be identified due to the extent of destruction. The analysis of the damage patterns yielded several clear findings that were consistent with eyewitness reports of a fire on board. The left main landing gear assembly showed clear signs of severe fire damage, in contrast to the right assembly. Similar fire damage was found on numerous wreckage components originating from the area of the left landing gear bay. As a result, the suspicion of an onboard fire was not only reinforced, but clearly confirmed. The central question now was how such a devastating fire could have occurred in the first place, and why the aircraft crashed only minutes after the fire began. The investigation therefore focused in particular on the left main landing gear assembly, the debris found on the runway, and the events that took place during taxi and takeoff on the morning of the accident. During the initial examination of the debris, investigators made a critical discovery. Evidence indicated that, during taxiing and up to the moment of liftoff, The aircraft's braking system had been subjected to extreme and prolonged overheating. This overheating led to the rupture of the rim of wheel number 4, while the aircraft was completing its final 180-degree turn before beginning its takeoff roll. Fragments recovered from the runway showed damage that can only occur at temperatures exceeding 250 degrees Celsius. Some components even displayed thermal damage consistent with temperatures above 300 degrees, far beyond anything seen in normal operation. Numerous brake discs, regardless of whether they originated from the left or right main landing gear, showed pronounced grooving. Other components of the braking system and landing gear also displayed signs of extreme stress under overheated conditions and were severely damaged. Although the most severe damage was found on the brakes of wheels number 3 and number 4, it was evident that the entire braking system must have been subjected to exceptionally high loads prior to takeoff. Investigators therefore examined the manufacturing and maintenance history of all wheels and brakes. No defects, pre-existing damage, or maintenance irregularities were found. At a takeoff weight of 44,600 kilograms, Flight 306 was close to its maximum permitted weight of 46,000 kilograms, but it was neither overloaded nor improperly balanced. On the evening before the accident, the aircraft had been brought into a hangar for an overnight inspection. During this so-called K-check, the brakes, wheels, landing gear, and hydraulic system were checked. No abnormalities were detected. During the night shift, wheels number 1, 5, and 6 were replaced. Brake adjustments and brake disc condition were checked. Again, without findings. On the morning of the accident, the aircraft was then towed to the gate at about 5:30 a.m. This operation likewise revealed no anomalies. There was no excessive towing force required, no tendency of the aircraft to veer sideways, and no signs of leakage. The subsequent pre-flight readiness check performed by a mechanic was also completed without findings. Although a technical defect in the landing gear could never be completely ruled out due to the high degree of destruction, it was considered very unlikely in light of the large amount of evidence to the contrary. Instead, investigators focused on how wheels and brakes behave under extreme thermal stress that was present on Flight 306. The results were alarming. In repeatedly conducted tests, the rupture of the rim of wheel number 4 could be reconstructed in a manner that closely matched the damage observed on the accident aircraft. With brake discs glowing white hot, an explosive separation of the rim flange occurred, accompanied by a sharp bang, with fragments being ejected at high speed. At the moment of rupture, measured temperatures ranged between 250 and 320 degrees Celsius. Immediately afterward, hydraulic fluid escaping from damaged lines as well as the exposed tyre ignited. The resulting damage matched the accident rim almost exactly. Tyre fragments recovered from the runway showed clear signs of extreme mechanical and thermal stress, most pronounced on tyre number 4. Burned hydraulic fluid was also found on runway 34, indicating that the fire must have begun on the ground shortly before the Caravelle took off. This assumption is supported by the statement of a weather service employee who was located approximately 120 meters from the threshold of runway 34 when the Caravelle passed by. He reported seeing through the fog, a low-lying light coming from the direction of the aircraft. It lasted about 2 seconds. Due to the dense fog, he was unable to see the aircraft itself. Nevertheless, this observation suggests that the light may have been a fire glow, originating in the landing gear area. The investigation clearly showed the dramatic consequences of severely overheated brakes. The question of how such extreme overheating could have occurred initially remained unanswered. But further witness statements and flight recorder data led investigators to a promising lead. A rare and meanwhile extinct aviation procedure called fog dispersal procedure. A method once used in dense fog to temporarily improve visibility. Could this forgotten procedure have been the trigger of the catastrophe? The fog dispersal procedure in general was an auxiliary technique used during the early jet age to temporarily improve visibility in ground fog. The runway was traversed with high engine thrust in order to locally displace the fog and briefly create a clear corridor. The procedure saw limited use from the late 1950s onward, but it was never standardized and proved unreliable, as the fog often returned quickly. With advancing technology and growing awareness of the risks inherent to the procedure, it was abandoned by the late 1960s and is no longer used in civil aviation today. This procedure was generally only rarely used in international civil aviation and was never widely adopted. At Swissair, however, this procedure was examined more closely during the early years of the jet age and was even incorporated into the training manual for Caravelle pilots. This was primarily due to the frequent fog conditions at Zurich Airport, where the airline had a strong presence and where operations were at times significantly disrupted by fog. The procedure as described by Swissair called for the aircraft to stop on the runway approximately every 500 meters, apply high engine thrust for about 15 seconds while holding the brakes, then continue taxiing and repeat this process along the length of the runway. In this way, several short-lived fog-free tunnels were intended to be created by the hot exhaust of the engines. However, this required near windless conditions, and even under ideal circumstances the effect lasted only briefly. When the Caravelle was introduced at Swissair and experience with jet aircraft was still limited, the minimum visibility for takeoff was initially set at 400 meters. During this period, the fog dispersal procedure was used comparatively more often. As operational experience increased, the minimum visibility for takeoffs was later reduced to 200 meters, causing the procedure to gradually lose its relevance. There are no precise records of how often this procedure was used at Swissair, but it was assumed at the time that, particularly after the reduction of the minimum takeoff visibility, it was applied only in isolated cases. No defects or special incidents associated with this procedure were recorded at Swissair prior to the accident. The fog dispersal procedure was viewed more critically by United Airlines, which also operated Caravelle aircraft. In an internal memorandum dated January 10, 1962, the airline published a critical statement.
The attempts to disperse fog by taxiing back and forth have been honest attempts to develop weather improvement. The results, however, have been an occasional perchance lifting, but more often resulting in blown tires. In other words, taxiing with excess thrust that must be contained by wheel brakes generates nothing but heat and subsequent blown tires.
On the morning of the accident, the reported visibility in Zurich shortly before the Caravelle's departure was 180 meters, placing it 20 meters below the prescribed minimum visibility. Against this background, it appeared likely that the cockpit crew of Flight 306 applied the fog dispersal procedure in an attempt to improve visibility conditions on the runway. Witnesses who were located on taxiway 3 while the Caravelle was taxiing reported that the aircraft, at least initially, moved along the runway with unusually high engine power. After the aircraft turned around at taxiway 7 and began moving back toward the threshold of runway 34, the engines, according to witness accounts, surged as if for takeoff. Both these eyewitness accounts and the data from the flight data recorder suggest that on the return to the takeoff position, the crew very likely applied elements of the fog dispersal procedure, but did not do so in accordance with the prescribed method. Instead of stopping as intended, the aircraft apparently proceeded along the runway with high engine power, while the brakes were simultaneously applied. Whether the pilots initially intended to turn the mere visibility inspection into an actual fog dispersal operation could never be conclusively determined. However, the evidence suggests that they did use the procedure, but not as prescribed. Tests in which the taxi behavior of Flight 306 was recreated using another Caravelle initially led to a sobering result. An incorrectly applied fog dispersal procedure alone was not sufficient enough to generate the extreme temperatures in the braking system that were documented on the accident aircraft. The additional increase in temperature must therefore have been caused by further braking during taxiing, either intentional or unintentional. Unintentional braking, for example as a result of a defect, would normally have affected only a single brake. However, no evidence supporting this scenario was found. Furthermore, since pronounced signs of wear were identified on both main landing gear assemblies, such a scenario is considered even less likely. Intentional, prolonged braking over the entire taxi distance is likewise unusual, but appears more conceivable under the poor visibility conditions prevailing that morning. It is possible that the pilots kept slight pressure on the brakes, initially while following the escort vehicle through the dense fog and later on the runway, in order to be able to stop quickly in case of an emergency. Another plausible explanation is that taxi speed can be adjusted more quickly and with greater precision at relatively high engine power when the aircraft is held on the brakes, rather than being regulated solely through thrust. Under the prevailing visibility conditions, it is therefore conceivable that the crew taxied with lightly applied brakes throughout the entire taxi phase, resulting in continuous brake drag. What exactly caused this additional temperature increase could never be conclusively determined. Regardless of the precise circumstances, however, the condition of the brake components clearly indicates that the braking system had been severely overheated over an extended period due to light to moderate braking. Corresponding tests reliably reproduced rim failures, such as the one that occurred on wheel number 4. At the conclusion of the investigation, it was established that Swissair Flight 306 had taken off with severely overheated brakes, leading to the development of an intense fire in the landing gear bay that ultimately caused the crash of the Caravelle. When the aircraft lifted off from runway 34 and the already burning landing gear was retracted, the fate of Flight 306 was tragically sealed. The landing gear bay of the Caravelle housed some of the aircraft's most critical systems: hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and fuel lines. At the time, no sensors or warning systems existed to alert the crew to a fire in this area. The first minutes of the flight initially passed without any apparent problems. This changed abruptly as the fire continued to spread. Investigators consider it very likely that, in the further course of events, rim number 3 also ruptured inside the landing gear bay due to heat. This would have caused additional damage to fuel and hydraulic lines. As a result, the fuel-fed fire spread from the left landing gear bay both outward through the fuselage skin and inward, thereby affecting the rear fuselage and the tail structure. Since the landing gear bay was not airtight, the fire was further intensified by the airflow, an effect that likely increased as the outer skin was breached more and more. The damage pattern confirms that the fire was driven through the fuselage by the airflow and re-emerged at the rear. Further explosions of the remaining tyres number 1 and 2 likely caused additional damage. The fact that the flight data recorder no longer received electrical power after a certain point suggests that the fire gradually destroyed critical electrical systems. It was also determined that the left engine was operating at low power at the time of the crash, while the right engine was producing high thrust. Whether the left engine was deliberately throttled back by the crew or failed due to a fire-induced interruption of the fuel supply could never be conclusively determined. It can be assumed that the flight characteristics of the Caravelle were progressively degraded by the fire, with one system after another failing until the aircraft ultimately became uncontrollable. Even an immediate attempt to return once the pilots became aware of the fire would in all likelihood not have been sufficient to reach Zurich for an emergency landing. The crew therefore had little to zero chance to save themselves. Post-mortem examinations revealed no evidence of smoke inhalation or burn injuries prior to impact. It is assumed that the fire did not penetrate into the cabin of the aircraft. However, it is highly likely that the occupants were well aware that their aircraft was on fire. In 1965, the Swiss Investigation Commission published its final report. It concluded, the crash was caused by the destruction of essential structural components as a result of a fire that originated from overheating of the brakes during the taxi phase. No legal proceedings were ever initiated to determine questions of guilt. From today's perspective, this appears understandable. Many of the hazards that compounded one another on that morning in Zurich were not yet sufficiently known or understood at the time. In particular, the risk of critical brake overheating caused by factors other than emergency braking, such as prolonged taxiing or the use of special procedures like the fog dispersal procedure, had not yet been adequately studied. The design of the aircraft itself also influenced the severity of the fire under the technical conditions of the early 1960s. While certain vulnerabilities are evident from a modern perspective, no individual responsibility can be assigned when judged against the state of the art of that era. Important safety systems taken for granted today did not yet exist. There were no fire detection systems in the landing gear bay, no automatic fire suppression systems, and thermal fusible plugs were still under development and had not been installed on the accident aircraft. In retrospect, the crash of Swissair Flight 306 must be understood as one of those catastrophes born from limited knowledge, technical constraints, and a lack of experience during the early jet age. Tragedies that only became fully understood after they had already occurred, and that ultimately led to fundamental improvements in aviation safety. Unfortunately, civil aviation required further catastrophic accidents before these lessons were truly learned. In the decades that followed, several other serious accidents occurred in which overheated brakes and landing gear components led to devastating fires. In 1986, 167 people lost their lives on board a Boeing 727 when a fire developed in the landing gear bay shortly after takeoff. The cause was severely overheated brakes combined with a burst tire. Thermal damage caused the aircraft's tail section to lose structural integrity, and Mexicana Flight 940 broke apart in mid-air before crashing in Mexico. In 1991, a similar accident even claimed the lives of 261 people aboard a Douglas DC-8. During takeoff from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, 2 underinflated tires burst due to high ambient temperatures and a long taxi distance. The exposed and jammed rims scraped along the runway, overheated, and ignited a fire in the landing gear bay. Once again, the fire led to a complete loss of control and the destruction of the aircraft. These later accidents demonstrated that the danger revealed by Swissair Flight 306 was not an isolated phenomenon. Only through repeated catastrophes was the full extent of the risk recognized, leading to technical measures designed to prevent such scenarios in modern aviation. The crash of Swissair Flight 306 plunged Switzerland into grief, mourning, and disbelief. Thousands of people took part in the funeral procession held in memory of the victims. Grieving relatives, senior political figures, Swissair employees, and citizens from across the country who came to express their sympathy. The village of Humlikon, located about 70 kilometers from the crash site, was hit especially hard by this catastrophe. More than half of the passengers came from this small community and were traveling together on a group trip. When the aircraft crashed, nearly 1/5 of the village's population was wiped out. 39 children were suddenly left orphaned or half-orphaned.
In the Caravelle were 44 people from the small village of Humlikon near Andelfingen, men and women from farming families. It was the annual trip of the village's agricultural cooperative. Humlikon has 210 inhabitants. 44 of them are dead today. They died, perhaps on one of the happiest days of their lives. They wanted to go to Geneva to an exhibition. They wanted to experience a beautiful day away from their hard and demanding farm work. It was their last day. Many aircraft pass over this village every day to London, to Frankfurt, to Munich. Perhaps that inspired them to see the world from above themselves. They saw it, 30 kilometers of it, and then the unimaginable happened. There are no words. It simply overwhelms you. A village where every 5th person died this morning, struck like lightning.
Today, more than 60 years later, little remains at the actual crash site to remind visitors of the tragedy of September 4th, 1963. Only a memorial by the roadside, just a few meters from the former impact site, still marks the location of the catastrophe. A second memorial was erected at the cemetery in Andelfingen, near the village of Humlikon, to commemorate the many victims who came from that small community. At the time, the crash of Swissair Flight 306 was the deadliest aviation accident in Swiss history and the deadliest accident involving a Caravelle. Aviation learned from this, and from other tragedies that followed. Out of loss came understanding, and from understanding came systems designed to detect, contain, and reduce the risk of such accidents ever happening again. But those lessons came too late for the people on board. And so, as this documentary comes to an end, we remember those who, more than 60 years ago, became part of aviation's tragic history when Swissair Flight 306 fell from the sky.